All right, hello y'all. Welcome to Historical Period 8. This is the last historical period of the class that can be tested on all of the parts of the exam, including featuring on the DBQ itself. And it covers the period from 1945, which is the end of World War II, through 1980, which is Ronald Reagan's election and represents a significant shift in American politics. So we're going to kind of jump right into this particular unit. It's a little bit more thematic than some of the other units as far as the way the College Board lays out the key concepts. So we're going to start with a series of key concepts about the Cold War, right? This is a unit, the foreign policy is very dominated by the Cold War in this time period. So we're going to start by sort of taking care of all of the Cold War key concepts, and then we'll move into some of the more domestic stuff. So the Cold War is a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that goes from 1945 all the way until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The College Board kind of cuts this off awkwardly in 1980, so we'll be talking a little bit more about the end of the Cold War in the next historical period video, but this one is really where the bulk of the Cold War kind of sits in and of itself. And if you take a look at this key concept here, this is 8.2. This is a pretty good kind of like overview or like bird's eye view of what the College Board wants you to know about the Cold War. There's a few things that are mentioned in here. Number one, that the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is something that develops out of post-war tensions. So as World War II ends, the United States and the Soviet Union in particular have different goals for what is going on in Europe. The United States wants most of the territory to be freed and to have democratic elections. The Soviet Union is looking to turn most of them into communist countries that will provide a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Germany in case of or in fear of another potential invasion in the future. And the kind of big, like, sort of central way that the College Board likes to talk about the Cold War is essentially, if you look at the very sort of last bullet point down here, where it talks about the Cold War sort of fluctuating between periods of direct, indirect confrontation and then détente. So that's sort of where we're going to start with the Cold War itself. The Cold War is most often tested in what's called continuity and change over time, right, or CCOT, so what sort of changes and what stays the same. The Cold War is a very long conflict. It covers 9 presidencies, starting with President Truman, and then Eisenhower, and then Kennedy, and then Johnson, and then Nixon, and then Ford, and then Carter, and then Reagan, and then the first President Bush, right? George H.W. Bush is president at the end of the Cold War. And so over those 9 presidencies, the single like strongest continuity that you can point to, if this is a question that comes up, is that the Cold War for the United States from the US perspective is dictated by what we call containment policy. This is the central policy of the United States during the Cold War, sort of our central, like our guiding principle basically. And what containment is, kind of as it sounds like, is a policy that the United States will do everything that it can to contain the spread of communism and to contain the influence of the Soviet Union. What this is saying is we're not going to attack communism where it already exists. We're not going to attack the Soviet Union because we have nuclear weapons now and World War III could be, deadly for all of mankind. But we are going to try our best to sort of like restrict or contain, right, the Soviet Union to the parts of the world that it already controls and to try to limit their ability to sort of spread their influence abroad. So every single president that I just listed all throughout the Cold War is trying to do containment, but they all have kind of different approaches to it, right? What is the best way to achieve containment is something that different presidents will have different answers to. And the College Board creates kind of like 3 different categories that you can talk about sort of like methods of containment, basically. One type is direct confrontation. This is where the United States and the Soviet Union are directly confronting each other, right, about something. And it tends to feature like the United States and the Soviet Union sort of battling it out as much as like the Cold War includes battles more directly. So good examples of this are the Berlin airlift, where we have the Soviets have blockaded the city of Berlin in an attempt to take the western half of Berlin, and then the United States and our allies are attempting to defeat that blockade, not by attacking it or dropping bombs on it, but by flying planes in to supply Berlin from the air, which we keep up for over a year. So that's a great example of like United States wants something, Soviet Union wants something, and the conflict is fairly direct. Another good example of something that's considered direct conflict is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which features Soviet missiles that have been placed on Cuba, and the United States' decision to set up a blockade around Cuba and demand that the Soviets remove their missiles, right, for the blockade to be removed. So that, again, is like a pretty direct confrontation between the 2 countries. Arguably most frequently what we see in the Cold War, though, is indirect confrontation. Indirect confrontation, from the United States perspective anyway, tends to feature the United States engaging with some other country or some issue that is about communism, but that doesn't necessarily involve the Soviet Union, at least not openly. The best examples of indirect conflict are usually proxy wars, where there is a war going on in another country, and then the United States kind of parachutes in to try to impose containment, right? To try to kind of make it about the Cold War. Most famous and most specific proxy wars are the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about in more depth in just a few slides here. But you can also point to things like the Truman Doctrine, which was President Truman in 1947, basically saying that the United States will provide sort of aid and support to any country that needs it to resist like a nascent communist uprising in their country. So that could also be potentially seen as indirect conflict, right? It's sort of a statement of policy. The last category that the College Board offers you is détente, which should have like a lovely little accent on there that I've missed. Détente is a term for a time period during a war. So you have two countries that are at war, where the two countries are having like friendlier relations, or they're called warmer relations sometimes. And what that tends to look like in the Cold War, in the context of the Cold War, is increased diplomacy between the United States and the Soviet Union, signing joint treaties. So the probably best examples of those are on the slide there. The SALT treaties, SALT is Strategic Arms Limitation talks. There's a SALT 1 and a SALT 2, both of which which do eliminate or limit the production and the storage of certain classes of nuclear weapons. And then we also have the Helsinki Accords. It's one of the big achievements of the sort of détente era of the Cold War, where the United States, the Soviet Union, and a whole bunch of other countries sign essentially a human rights treaty agreeing to respect other countries' borders. So those are examples of détente. Other détente things in addition to treaty signing are things like summit meetings between the United States president and the Soviet premier that happen periodically throughout, especially kind of the later part of the Cold War. Here's another way of looking at this sort of fluctuation, direct, indirect, and détente. So this is our Cold War presidents who fall inside of this time period, so sort of everybody through Carter. And then kind of what I've done on here is circled all of the things that I would consider direct in red. You can see Berlin Airlift right there, for example. All the things that I would consider indirect, more in blue. And then the détente stuff in orange. And you'll notice that détente really is sort of dominating the 1970s. It's a policy that's introduced under Richard Nixon and continued under Ford, and then kind of reluctantly continued under Carter as well. So that's really the era that it's associated with. So this is a good one to sort of pause on, take a look at if you're sort of finding yourself unfamiliar with the Cold War and wanting to refresh some memories there. So that's sort of like Cold War overview. Some other kind of specific things about the Cold War that the College Board would like you to know. They do want you to know a little bit about how the Cold War impacts sort of the rest of the world, or kind of United States diplomatic efforts in the rest of the world. So in particular, like a term that's coined in the United States State Department in this time period is this idea of like the First World, Second World, and Third World. This is very outdated terminology, but it dates to the Cold War, so I think it's useful to understand. And what the sort of First World, Second World, Third World paradigm is the United States State Department basically is like, okay, all of the countries that are allied with us, the United States, that's the first world, like those countries are good. And then the countries that are allied with the Soviet Union, which are kind of in like yellowy orange on the map here, that's the second world, and that's not good, but like they're aligned, right? They've picked a side. And then all of the countries that are left, the countries that are not allied with us and they're not allied with the Soviet Union, that's the third world. And the third world is sort of like up for grabs, right, in this sort of great Cold War struggle. And so increasingly, starting I think in the 1950s and then continuing periodically throughout the Cold War, the United States and then Soviet Union also for its part are going to look at sort of the rest of the globe as like a sort of source of struggle, right, a place where they can kind of play out the Cold War and Cold War diplomacy. So a few examples of that. In Latin America in particular, the United States is going to support several like authoritarian, which is like a little bit of a nicer way of saying sort of dictator-y leaders in various Latin American countries because they are like specifically not communist, right? So these are leaders who are maybe not great on their human rights records, right? But they do have a strong kind of anti-communist position. And so the United States, sometimes openly and then sometimes covertly through the CIA, is going to support them. This is also the era when the United States really starts to get involved in Middle East politics, which you don't really see us doing before World War II. Our kind of initial entree comes with a strong support for the creation of the Nation of Israel, which happens officially in 1948. And the United States continues to be a major ally to Israel sort of from then on, which continues to increase our involvement in the region. Another early example is the United States' role in negotiating an end to the Suez Crisis. The Middle East is a great example of a region in this time period, sort of in the kind of immediate aftermath of World War II, where we're seeing a lot of nationalist movements, right? Movements by leaders in places like Egypt, for example, who are looking to push out kind of colonial forces, the British, the French, right, who have been dominant in the Middle East for a long time and who have taken or bought up most of like the oil lands and control most of the sort of infrastructure like the Suez Canal. And these nationalist leaders in these often newly independent countries are looking to kind of take those and control them for their own country. So that's sort of what's at the heart of the Suez Crisis. There is also a set of countries who essentially are what is called non-aligned, right, on purpose, who deliberately choose not to sort of take sides, right, in the Cold War. You can see a list of them down there at the bottom. I think India is one of the more significant in this time period. Yugoslavia as well are both play sort of significant roles here. So it's good to understand that the United States and the Soviet Union both saw essentially the world as this kind of like battleground, and that it was the driving factor in basically all of America's foreign policy in this time period. Even if you sort of look at an event and it doesn't really look like it has to do with the Cold War, it probably does under the surface, because we're very concerned about winning kind of hearts and minds and alliances wherever we can around the world. The only specific like Cold War event that the College Board calls out like in its own key concept, so your most significant Cold War event and the one that you really need to know about in more depth than any other, is the Vietnam War, or the American War in Vietnam, right, more accurately. So the specific like sort of ask that the College Board has here is causes and effects of the Vietnam War. So we're not going to get so much into the war itself, although it's obviously interesting and quite relevant. But we are going to just talk a little bit about sort of the causes of United States involvement in Vietnam and then how that winds up impacting the American kind of like home front, as it were. First up, causes. The Vietnam War, like the Korean War and like a lot of United States involvement elsewhere around the world, comes out of our concern in the wake of World War II that as the sort of great colonial empires either collapse, right, lots of countries gain their independence, that there will be sort of like a vacuum and that communism will fill that. So in this area that you're seeing on the map in particular, Southeast Asia, lots of this used to be controlled by France. It was called French Indochina by the French. The French fought to retain control of this territorial possession after World War II, but they are defeated at a battle called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And when the French withdraw from the region and this area becomes 4 independent countries, is when the United States gets involved. Our primary concern is that of the 4 countries, so we have Laos, Cambodia, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam, one of those countries, North Vietnam, is founded as a communist country, right? There had been a strong communist organization that had led a lot of the opposition to the Japanese and then to the French. And so they're going to have a government that's headquartered in Hanoi in North Vietnam. And the United States becomes convinced that there is like essentially a very strong danger to containment in this area, right? That if we are not careful, that this single, communist country of North Vietnam, backed by China, which is also communist at this point, you can see right to the north of Vietnam, is going to sort of lead to all of the other countries in the region becoming communist, and then we'll have this like massive failure of containment and communism will spread, etc. The term for that specific theory, so this specific application of containment, is domino theory, which sees South Vietnam basically as like the crucial domino. You can kind of see the cartoon there. And if South Vietnam falls, it's going to kind of take out all of the other countries in the region and they will all become communist. And so for this reason, several successive United States presidencies basically feel very committed to the idea that we need to maintain like a stable, independent South Vietnam, even if we maybe like don't much like their government or have quibbles with how things are going. Like it's very important to us that South Vietnam stay a non-communist country and be kind of like relatively stable. The first U.S. presidency to be involved here is Eisenhower. In the 1950s, and then this continues through the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Under Eisenhower and Kennedy, what we are doing is sending like diplomatic and military advisors to kind of like prop up South Vietnam. We are doing a lot of investment in the country, sending American companies and things like that to build roads and think about infrastructure and all those types of things. So we're trying to kind of make a partner, right, of South Vietnam. And then under Johnson, the sort of situation in South Vietnam has escalated escalated to the point where the president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, is assassinated in 1963, right before Kennedy is assassinated himself. And with Diem's assassination, Vietnam is unstable enough that Johnson fears that the only way to keep South Vietnam non-communist is to send American troops. And so Johnson will send first American planes to bomb North Vietnam, and then eventually American troops, Marines at first in 1965. And that is what really begins the American War in Vietnam. So the sort of start date of the American War in Vietnam is 1964. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Gulf of Tonkin in just a second here. So that's sort of causes of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War lasts for 9 years. It starts in 1964, and American troops are not going to be withdrawn until 1973. That's a very long time. And as you should know, hopefully, it's going to wind up being quite an unpopular war. It's going to feature the largest anti-war movement in American history by the time it is over. The Vietnam War is very sort of like draining on the American economy and on kind of like American public goodwill towards the government. Johnson has a very ambitious set of social programs that we will talk about a little bit later on in this video called the Great Society, which he really wants to spend a lot of his sort of like time and attention and money on. But the Vietnam War becomes this sort of like quagmire that we can't get pulled out of, and it really winds up occupying a lot of Johnson and sort of like the American public's attention during his presidency. The Vietnam War, again, quite quickly becomes unpopular. At the beginning of the war, there's sort of like general support, a small anti-war movement, the same thing that we see for most wars. But by the time that we hit the last full year of Johnson's presidency, which is 1968, a majority of Americans have sort of turned against the war and believe that the United States, like, we made a mistake getting in and that we should pull our troops out. The Johnson administration is continuing to escalate our presence in Vietnam, so we're continuing to sort of send more and more and more troops. But we're trying to tell the American people that we were holding the position, that we're still doing the same thing. Our mission is still the same. We're still just trying to kind of protect South Vietnam. That didn't really feel very true to the American people. So when the war comes to an end, it comes to an end not under Johnson, but under the next president, Richard Nixon, who also has a long fight to sort of get us to this point. The treaty that ends the American presence in Vietnam is called the Paris Peace Accords. So it's basically another Treaty of Paris. We needed more of those. And what the Paris Peace Accords do is they sort of withdraw the United States troops from Vietnam and then have sort of South and North Vietnam kind of like hold their positions. So the idea here from our perspective is that like we're sort of getting out of the Vietnam War and kind of leaving it in progress. We'll sort of let the South Vietnamese kind of like take over at this point. When Nixon makes this agreement, I don't think that he or anybody else in his government really truly thinks that South Vietnam will be able to sustain their government's independence on their own like forever. That's why we've been there for 9 years, right? We don't believe that the government can do that. But I do think that Nixon hopes that South Vietnam can sustain themselves for long enough that if/when it eventually falls, it won't look like the United States' fault, right? So this Paris Peace Accords is not a glorious, triumphant peace treaty. It's a way for us to try to sort of get out and save face, right? Not look like we've lost. Unfortunately, with the Watergate scandal, Nixon leaves. North Vietnam kind of takes advantage of that and will surge into the South in 1975. And so basically about a year and a half after the Paris Peace Accords, North invades the South. They take the capital city of Saigon in the spring of 1975. That falls. Today it's called Ho Chi Minh City. And Vietnam is reunited as a communist country. There is no more country of South Vietnam. And the United States has lost, basically, right? Containment has failed in this particular case after, 9+ years, 15 years, right? Depending on how you want to measure it. The Vietnam War has a very negative effect on the American public. Overall, it creates a tremendous amount of mistrust in the government, especially after the leak of a set of papers called the Pentagon Papers to major news media. The Pentagon Papers were secret government documents that very clearly showed that what the Johnson and even Kennedy and Eisenhower administrations were saying to the American public about what we were doing in Vietnam was like at best misleading and at worst was like an outright lie, right, about what our sort of goals were and what, how we were doing. Are we winning? All of those kinds of things. The American people and actually Congress as well were being misled about. The Vietnam War also leads to a kind of like a deep reluctance in the kind of American public to support sending troops abroad again. We pull out of Vietnam in 1973, and we're not going to send American troops abroad again until 1983 for about 10 years. So again, the Vietnam War overall is sort of like a deeply negative impact on the United States, and key to understand its role as a proxy war or an example of like, again, an indirect way of fighting the Cold War itself. Lots of the stuff on this slide will kind of come up in later key concepts as well, so we'll be swinging back to some of this stuff, but that is kind of the part of the Vietnam War that you need to know about for the Cold War itself. Last Cold War thing, before we move on to other topics, is that in addition to the fighting of the Cold War abroad, there's also kind of a Cold War home front as well, or sort of home front impacts of the Cold War. The College Board specifically calls out the Red Scare here. We're going to talk about that, and we're also going to talk about a couple of others that I think are important. So first off, one of the first kind of like visible impacts of the Cold War on Americans at home is what is called the Red Scare, or really the second Red Scare. We have two Red Scares in the United States, one after World War I, that's the first Red Scare, and then this one that we're talking about now after World War II, this is the second Red Scare. Both of the two Red Scares are periods of like panic or paranoia in the United States about the fear that our government might be overthrown by communism. That idea that, communism is sort of like lurking and sort of ready at any time. The first Red Scare, of course, is triggered by the Russian Revolution, which does successfully overthrow the government of Russia and, turn it into a communist country. And the second Red Scare is really triggered by the Cold War, right? And by this sort of advent of hostilities, essentially, between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's good to know sort of the differences between the two Red Scares as well. The first Red Scare, the one right after World War I, was much more focused on the danger of immigrants, right? It was right at the peak of immigration to America, and a lot of the panic focused on this idea that these immigrants from like Eastern Europe were kind of bringing radical ideas, and they were like secretly sort of, importing communism into the United States, and what we need to do is we need to shut down immigration and deport radical immigrants, right? That was what the first Red Scare was really focused on. This Red Scare, the one after World War II, is much more focused on the threat of espionage, the idea that there might be secret communist sympathizers. They won't look any different than you and me, right? But they're sort of embedded in everyday American society, and especially the big scare is that they might be embedded in the government, right? This is fueled by a couple of high-profile cases of espionage trials, in particular the Rosenberg trial in the early 1950s, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who are put on trial for selling atomic secrets to the Soviet Union and then eventually executed. The way that the second Red Scare plays out is largely through a series of government investigations into various aspects of the government and also of American society. President Truman kind of kicks this off with what he calls his loyalty program, where government employees have to sign a loyalty oath to the country. They have to vow that they are not and have never been associated with communism, and they get called in and sort of interviewed about their loyalties or their affiliations. This also gets picked up by Congress. In the House, we have what's usually unpleasantly referred to as HUAC, but it's the House Un-American Activities Committee that starts up, and HUAC investigates the presence of communism in Hollywood film industry. So the idea here being that there might be secret communists in Hollywood who are sneaking covert Soviet messages into film scripts or things like that. Nobody's arrested. You're not going to jail for this, but it does ruin a lot of people's careers in Hollywood. There's a blacklist created. So that's what's going on in the House with HUAC. In the Senate, what we have is what's usually called McCarthyism, named after a junior senator from Wisconsin, a guy named Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy is looking for power and looking for leverage, and sort of hits on this sort of Red Scare time period. And what he claims is to have a list of known communists, active members of the Communist Party who are working in the United States State Department. He does not really turn out to have that list, but the investigation sort of spirals throughout several government departments, sort of drags a lot of people in, creates, again, an atmosphere of sort of fear and paranoia, and this is all going on throughout kind of the late 1940s and the early 1950s. So that's sort of the second Red Scare. Again, a good example of a home front impact. One thing to be careful about is not to talk about this going on for too long, right? The Red Scare is not happening in the 1960s or the 1970s. It's very specifically to this, again, early period of the Cold War. Some other kind of Cold War, home fronty type things that I think are worth knowing about as well that I think hit a bunch of different key concepts and work best here. Number one, the Cold War kicks off a lot of debate in the United States about the sort of idea of nuclear power. We have the nuclear bomb first, right? We use the atomic bomb to end World War II, and then the Soviets catch up pretty quickly. They're going to explode their first nuclear weapon in 1949. I believe that's correct, just a few years later. And then from then on out, this kicks off what's usually known as the arms race, as we each try to sort of match or outdo each other. First, in terms of types of bombs. So once the Soviets have the atomic bomb, we start to work on the next level up, the H bomb or the hydrogen bomb. We develop that, they develop that. And then we start to work on things like delivering of bombs. So ICBMs are basically bombs on missiles. So you don't have to fly a plane and drop your bomb. You can just hit a button, right, and fire from a long range away. ICBM stands for intercontinental ballistic missiles, so long range ballistic missiles. And we also start to focus on sort of building up, not just like how good are the bombs that we have, but how many do we have as well, building up a nuclear arsenal. And the impacts of that on the American civilians are to cause, I mean, logically, to cause a lot of people to really worry very deeply about the possibility of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Impacts of this socially, kind of most famously, are schools deciding to teach duck and cover drills to teach children what to do in case of a nuclear war. We see companies selling fallout shelters to families, for your backyard or your basement, to protect you. The federal government encouraged every municipality, every city to have a civil defense plan. Like, what does the city of, Chapel Hill, North Carolina do if there's a nuclear bomb headed our way? Like, what's the town's plan for that? So, some people took this more seriously and were more scared by it than others, but it was definitely kind of like a prevailing cultural element of the 50s especially, but the Cold War in general. Another thing as well that sort of springs out of the arms race is what's called the space race. In 1957, the Soviets sort of shock the United States by launching what's usually called Sputnik as the first artificial or man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. This really freaks us out because we are nowhere near being able to do this in the United States. Our rockets keep exploding before they can get out of the atmosphere. And so this kicks us into a little bit of a panic that we're sort of falling behind in technology. It leads to the NDEA, the National Defense Education Act, which pushes a lot more science and math education down into K-12 schools. And it also leads to the space race. We found NASA. We start to really pour a lot of money and energy into space technology. The United States essentially declares victory in the space race when we put the first man on the moon in 1969, which is the sort of picture in the middle of the slide there. In addition to all of these kind of Cold War home front impacts, all of if you think about everything I just talked about, the arms race, the space race, ICBMs, it's expensive, right? You're spending a lot of money, we're making a lot of stuff, and a lot of that money is really fueling the United States economy. The Cold War essentially serves as a pump primer for the United States economy in this time period. The federal government is pouring a tremendous amount of money into defense, military spending, among other things as well. And so that has quite a big impact on the sort of boom in the post-war economy as well. Last kind of little Cold War-y type thing, a couple of the key concepts, if you sort of look scattered throughout, we'll talk a little bit about the sort of debates that come from the Cold War, what sorts of things were Americans discussing or debating as a result of the Cold War. One of them is basically what I was just mentioning, which is the sort of relationship between the United States government and then the economy, and specifically defense contractors and the economy. President Eisenhower, in his farewell address in 1961, coins the term military-industrial complex to refer to this. And what Eisenhower's fear was basically that essentially the American economy would become so dependent on government money, government funding, that they would become so intertwined that it would be sort of long-term harmful for the economy and for the country. So there was a lot of debate again about that, about essentially how much defense spending is good for the country. There's also quite a lot of debate, as I mentioned earlier, about essentially the idea of a nuclear arsenal. Should we be stockpiling nuclear warheads? How many do we need to keep up with the Soviets? Is it better for us to have a lot of them? That would ensure our safety. That was basically what Eisenhower argued, that if we have a lot and they have a lot, then neither of us will push the button, right? Called MAD, or mutually assured destruction. Or is this more of a danger to us, right? There's a very large anti-nuclear well, not very large, but there's a very vocal anti-nuclear movement that sort of kicks up in the 1950s and continues throughout the Cold War, and arguably still today, that opposes the use of any nuclear technology. If you look at that little graph that's right there on the slide, what that's looking at is estimated nuclear stockpiles at any given point, and you can see that the United States hits our peak nuclear stockpile right basically at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have about 26,000, I think, is the number of nuclear warheads that I've usually seen. It's a lot, right? So we have a very, very large nuclear arsenal for most of the Cold War. The last sort of debate, and something that I was kind of hinting at a little bit earlier as well, that comes out of the Cold War, is basically how much power should the executive branch have in foreign policy? Traditionally, foreign policy, immigration, right, those have been things that have been most directly under the control of the executive branch. But the Congress plays a role too. The Senate has to ratify treaties, things like that. But one of the things that the Cold War does is it's really going to start to shift a lot more power into the executive branch, which it continues to have today, to do sort of various foreign policy things, and in particular to send troops abroad without congressional approval. The sort of classic example of this, and I think the thing that really raises the most debate, is around the Vietnam War. So I mentioned that the Vietnam War starts under Johnson in 1964. Johnson actually wants Congress to declare war. Congress doesn't want to declare war. He's a little bit worried about escalating things. So instead, what Congress does is they pass a law called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is often referred to as a blank check, because it basically just gives whoever the president is, which is Johnson and then Nixon, right, during the war, the power to kind of like at will retaliate against North Vietnam. It doesn't put any limits on like how many troops, how much money, how long they can be there, what kinds of missions they can engage in. It's just sort of all at the president's discretion. Again, it's usually referred to as a blank check for the Vietnam War. And what that allows Johnson and then Nixon to do is to run what is very clearly a war without a declaration of war, right? That's not really how the Constitution's set up. That's not really how it's supposed to work. And so one of the big reasons why many people come to oppose the Vietnam War is that it's this like undeclared war, and it feels like it's being run very secretively, right, from the executive branch. As I mentioned, the Johnson administration is continually denying escalating while sort of people are seeing like there's more troops there and it seems like we're escalating. You'll see a lot of political cartoons that sort of play on this idea of like, sort of climbing stairs or climbing an escalator in Vietnam. And so as the Vietnam War winds down, in response to this sort of sense that the Vietnam War kind of like went too far, put too much power in the hands of the executive, we get the 1973 War Powers Act, which is supposed to restrict the ability of the president to send troops abroad without congressional approval. So there's this sort of like balance or debate that's going on about like how much should the president be able to do sort of by himself, right, or unilaterally. Okay, so that was the Cold War. Now we're moving over into more kind of like domestic stuff for the rest of the video, still again in our same time period of 1945 up to 1980. And so sort of the first chunk of stuff here is looking basically at what's going on in the 1950s and 60s culture. And the College Board in two different key concepts is calling out kind of economic growth and then also the rise of mass culture as being kind of like the key things to know about this time period. So let's dig into these just a little bit. First off, economic growth. The period from World War II ending in 1945 through about 1969 is one of the longest sustained periods of economic growth in American history. The Cold War, as the slide indicates, is sort of pump priming the American economy, right? The government is spending a tremendous amount of money on military, defense, right, type spending that's kind of bumping the economy up. We are also growing our middle class quite a bit, right? This is the era of the baby boom and the GI Bill, right? Kind of growing Americans' middle class very significantly. So in general, this is sort of like a prosperous period of economic growth, right? The 1950s and the 1960s overall, as you can see measured here in GDP. One of the things that's fueling this is that we are seeing kind of a steady march of new technology. You do not need to know every single one of the technologies on this slide, but I would suggest picking kind of like one or two. In particular, I think it's very good to know that the television is a sort of 1950s boom invention. It's actually invented really more right around the time of World War II, but the 50s is when it really sort of takes over American households and becomes a very significant media, and it's also obviously a significant kind of impact on the economy as it brings new forms of advertising and things like that as well. If you look kind of broadly at like what's going on technology here, you'll notice there's sort of two things happening at the same time. We have what I would consider kind of like home appliances and devices, and then they're sort of alongside like Cold War style scientific advances. So it's like, microwave ovens and the H-bomb, right? Those are sort of the two big categories of technological advance that we're really seeing in this time period. Again, because the Cold War is driving so much of the sort of funding in this time period as far as like what's being researched and et cetera. The other thing to be a little bit careful about with technologies is that a lot of the sort of what you might think of when we think about kind of like recent important technologies do not actually come from this like historical period that we are in here, historical period 8. They actually come from more recently. So you want to be careful about things like home computers and the internet in particular, and just make sure if you're looking at like, let's say an LEQ about technology, that it goes late enough for you to be able to talk about those. The technology for home computers comes from the World War II era and from the development of essentially bombing sites in World War II bombing planes. But as far as like I, a kind of individual person, have a computer in my home, the 1980s is really the decade where that happens. Universities have computers in this time period. The government has computers, right? NASA has computers to put men on the moon, but individual people don't. The same thing is true for internet. Internet comes about a decade after home computers. It starts to kind of popularize during the 1990s. And then you are probably about as old as the smartphone if you are watching this video right now. So if our smartphones come out in about 2007. So that's like just a word on technology and just kind of being careful about not advancing too far beyond the time period of the prompt. Other kind of like mass cultural type things from this time period, the College Board really likes to track shifts in demographics, like where are people kind of moving. This is part of the migration theme of the course. So there's several kind of big migration patterns that are happening in this period after World War II. Remember that World War II really moved people around the country a lot, and so this period is sort of reacting to that. Number one, the Great Migration, which has been going on since World War I, continues. This is the migration of African Americans out of the rural South and into urban centers in the North, and then increasingly in this time period we're talking about out to the West Coast to places like Los Angeles, Oakland, right, in particular. So that continues. The African American Great Migration doesn't really stop or slow down or start to decline until the sort of manufacturing decline that starts in the 1970s, so sort of tied to that economic feature. Another big demographic change, and one that represents a significant change, something that's different, is the flight out of cities and into suburbs that starts pretty much immediately after World War II. This is a reversal of a demographic trend that we've seen for most of the rest of the class previously, right? The whole rest of U.S. history has been about urbanization, right? People moving from rural areas into the city, and now here, starting in like the late 40s through the 50s, 60s, 70s, we're seeing that trend reverse as people sort of leave the cities for the suburbs, which they feel are kind of like safer. They're close to the cities, right? You can still commute and work in the city, but it's supposed to be like a better environment to raise children. Sociologists sometimes call this like sort of phase of demographic migration, the cities out of the cities and into the suburbs, quote unquote white flight, because there were a lot of restrictions that governed basically like who was actually able to get their families out of the cities. In particular, remember that most suburbs had racial covenants in the 1950s and 60s until 1968, which restricted like if you owned a home in the suburbs, you weren't allowed to sell it to anyone who wasn't white in most suburbs in this time period. And then inside of cities themselves, most cities in this time period are operating under a redlining style of policy that creates essentially like disincentives for banks and for city governments to serve communities that are kind of redlined to be like targeted or tagged basically as kind of like lower income or less trustworthy or less valuable. So you have people who are able to leave the cities are able to move out to the suburbs and sort of see their wealth increase, and then people who remain in the cities often see the sort of value of their property and the services that are offered to them kind of declining in this time period because of redlining. Other migratory patterns that are happening, what's usually called Rust Belt to Sun Belt migration. I've seen Frost Belt sometimes too, but I think Rust Belt is more common. The Rust Belt is the area kind of up around the Great Lakes where the kind of Gilded Age era industrial revolution was very strong. Cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, right, Cincinnati, etc. Those are areas that are going to start to decline in population as people leave them and move more and more to the Sun Belt down here, kind of highlighted in, I guess, kind of yellowish colors, which is basically the South and Southwest. So this is states like Florida, Texas, some states in the South, Arizona, California, right, those types of states where we increasingly have tech industries founded, and California's Silicon Valley, right, is a great example, and also where like the weather is very nice and where we're increasingly going to see a lot of the population from cross-border Mexican immigration as well. Speaking of immigration, the three that we've talked about so far are migration inside of the United States, but there's also immigration changes, right, coming to the U.S. That are different. In 1965, under Johnson during the Great Society, the United States passes the Immigration Act of 1965. This gets rid of the quota system that has been in place since the 1920s and replaces it with essentially the system that we have today, which prioritizes family migration of people who already have families who are U.S. citizens or U.S. residents, migration for refugees, right? People who are fleeing from some aspect in their home country, violence usually, right, or threats of violence, and then also prioritizes people with special skills, so people who are sort of going to bring some kind of skill to the American economy. As a result of this change of the Immigration Act, we start kind of the third big wave of American immigration. Remember, the first one before the Civil War was mostly people from like Ireland and Germany, right, Western Europe. The second one, in the time period of the Gilded Age Progressive Age, saw a lot of new immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe. And then this third wave of immigration that we're still in the middle of right now is increasingly going to see immigration from Latin America, Asia more broadly, right? Not just China, but kind of like all over Asia, and also not listed on here, but we're going to see a big uptick in immigration from Africa as well. So those are some significant demographic trends from this time period. Also big in kind of like the 50s and 60s culture is the continued rise of mass culture. This is something that we've sort of been tracking in this course since kind of the late 1800s, as we saw things like catalogs and department stores, right, start to introduce mass culture. And then in the 1920s, it was like movies, the movie industry, and radio, right? And now here we are in the 1950s, 1960s, into the 1970s, and there's some familiar things and also some kind of new things that are encouraging or like sustaining or maintaining mass culture. A really big one continues to be media, right? Television in general very much promotes a very kind of middle class, nuclear family based ideal. I also just mentioned television advertising, right? That's the type of thing that tends to promote, kind of cultural norms, right? Are very commonly promoted through advertising. And the cultural norms that are being promoted by the television and advertising industry in this time period are basically the ideals of the nuclear family in the suburbs, right? This is sort of the ideal 1950s kind of vision of what like American life is like. The suburbs have this sort of very visual conformity that was appealing to a lot of people, and it's also going to come in for a lot of critique, which we'll talk a bit about on the next slide. We see the rise of essentially kind of like office work in this time period. I think by like 1956, I think is the date when we see a majority of American men are now working in what we might call white collar jobs, right? They work in like insurance companies, or they work in advertising or HR, right? They sell fertilizer, right? Those types of jobs are starting to rise in competition, I guess you could say, with manufacturing. So those are some things that are kind of maintaining culture. The 1950s also sees a big rise in car culture. So an interest in Americans in sort of buying cars, buying new cars, buying two cars for their families, right? That's kind of on the rise. But also sees a very heavy investment by the American government in car infrastructure as well, right? We are going to really kind of double down on cars here in the 1950s under Eisenhower. In 1956, Congress passes the Federal Aid Highway Act, I think is the name of it. And what that does is it provides a tremendous amount of funding. It's a massive infrastructure bill to build an interstate system, right? Roadways that go between multiple states maintained by the federal government. Eisenhower sort of sells this to Congress by arguing that we need it for civil defense, right? For the Cold War, like if Russia, if the Soviet Union invades, we need to be able to get our tanks and our soldiers sort of around the country rapidly. But the main impact it actually has on Americans is it just makes travel around the country both easier, but also much more car dependent in terms of how people are getting from place to place. Car culture tends to foster, I'm trying to say monogamy, tends to foster kind of a monoculture, homogeny, because there's a lot of businesses that spring up that cater to people in cars that are things like fast food chains, right, like the first McDonald's, motel chains, restaurant chains, right, that cater to people in cars. Another thing that sort of encourages mass culture in this time period, or especially encourages conformity, is the sort of threats that come from the Cold War itself, right? The Cold War comes with a series of sort of scares that are really about trying to root out people inside of American society who are maybe secretly communist or secretly subversive or trying to undermine the American government, in favor of the Soviet Union. So we talked just a little bit ago about the Red Scare, right, which is this sort of hunt for secret communists. You can see where that might potentially make someone want to conform or fit in. Also kind of parallel to the Red Scare is something that historians have called the Lavender Scare. This was a government hunt for people who were, we would say, LGBTQ today. They generally use the term homosexual in this time period if they were being polite, who were working inside of the government. And the idea here was that this was a threat because they would be vulnerable to blackmail, right, if their sort of real, true identity came out. And so we know that at least a couple of thousand, I think 5,000 is a number that you often see, people are like kind of investigated and then fired from various government jobs in this time period. So again, those are things that are encouraging kind of general conformity with like kind of the visible American ideals in this time period. We also see challenges to mainstream or mass culture in this time period. They often come from kind of counterculture or intellectual movements. A few examples in the 1950s, we see several writers who critique 1950s culture as being too consumerist and too kind of empty, this sort of like little boxes, people living in little boxes. That's a quote from a Malvinia Reynolds protest song. In particular, on the sort of far left of the slide here, you see this book here, The Organization Man. This was written by William White, as a sociologist, to critique kind of like conformity and office culture in America. We also see, I would say, sort of more artistic critiques as well of society in this time period. So the movement, what's called the Beat movement or the Beatniks, right, featuring people like Allen Ginsberg, who published like works of art, right, literature. Howl is Ginsberg's most famous poem that, again, critique kind of like this idea that 1950s society is very empty and kind of consumer-driven, meaningless, right? You should sort of link the critiques of 1950s culture with the critiques of 1920s culture that the Lost Generation writers offered, 30 years earlier. I'm going to click off this and then come right back to it because there's also some other intellectual writers in this time period that you maybe should kind of have heard of or need to know names of. These are people who are sometimes referred to or discussed as kind of like a new generation of muckrakers because they're doing kind of nonfiction writing that's intended to expose like a problem in American society and get Americans to think about it. We have Rachel Carson, who writes the book Silent Spring about the use of pesticides and DDT. It's often given credit for kicking off the environmental movement. We have Betty Friedan, who writes a book called The Feminine Mystique, which is basically about, she interviews a bunch of women housewives in the 1950s and writes about how they feel like their lives are unfulfilling and that the sort of suburban ideal of like the stay-at-home mom is not kind of like really bringing meaning to their lives. It's often given credit for kicking off the feminist movement in the 1960s. And then at the bottom, we have a book by a very young Ralph Nader, who you might know later in his political career as the founder of the Green Party. In the 1960s, Nader first comes to attention when he publishes a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, where he basically reveals how dangerous cars are and how much the auto manufacturers knew that cars were dangerous and how little they cared because there were no federal regulations requiring them to like crash test or safety test or anything like that. And that will change, as we'll talk about a little bit later. So those are some examples of kind of like critiques coming from like the intellectual class, basically. Other critiques of mass culture come from the various civil rights movements of the time period. I think we're going to talk more about these movements in depth in the next couple of slides, but it's good to understand that what movements like the African American civil rights movement or the feminist movement or the Chicano movement are doing is they are critiquing the norms of society, right? They're saying like the way that society operates, the status quo is not good, and we are challenging that and challenging society to do better. So again, it's good to understand those as challenges to mass culture. And then we also tend to see challenges throughout kind of these decades that we're talking about from the youth of the time period, sometimes organized and sometimes not. So in the 1950s, we don't really have like organized, youth protest, but we do have a teen culture develop around things like rock and roll in particular that present some challenges to kind of the mainstream adult-led culture, right, of the earlier 1950s. Most famously, we definitely have the teen counterculture of the 1960s, right? These are the hippies who engage in a tremendous amount of like social political protests, right? The various movements we're going to talk about, but also are just kind of rejecting the values of their parents' generation, rejecting conformity, rejecting affluence and materialism in favor of, dropping out of society and joining a commune, let's say, for example, right? So those are, again, examples of like challenges to mass culture. Speaking of the various movements of this time period, we're going to start to get into and talk a little bit about some of the movements, and we're going to start with the most significant and definitely first, which is the African American Civil Rights Movement. If you take a look at these three concepts, these are the three key concepts that really kind of cover what the College Board wants you to know about the African American Civil Rights Movement. And if you kind of dig into these, the College Board mostly tends to divide things into wanting you to know about like things that the U.S. government did to advance the civil rights movement, and then things that activists did to advance the civil rights movement, mostly by pushing the government to do more. So that's sort of what we're going to dig into here in the next couple of slides. First up, things that the government did. So if we're looking at sort of federal government civil rights actions, this is a pretty good kind of like compilation of the top hits as far as we go here. And so really like a number one with a bullet is President Truman's decision to use an executive order to desegregate the military in 1947, which is after World War II, but before Korea. Truman did this in response to a series of protests led by the NAACP, who were responding to a series of very violent attacks on black servicemen who were demobilizing after World War II. Some of them were beaten or attacked in various violent ways. Truman has a commission and comes out with this recommendation to desegregate the armed services. It's a really big deal. It's one of the first kind of like permanent government moves towards supporting civil rights. Next one down, very significant, the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board, right? This overturns Plessy versus Ferguson and declares that segregation, even if it's equal, right, that's just separate segregated facilities, are inherently unequal just by virtue of being separate. And so it rules essentially that school desegregation needs to happen, which is going to be a task that will consume the civil rights movement for about the next almost 15 years, really. After Brown versus Board, what we see basically is the actions of activists, which we'll talk about a little bit on the next slide, really pushing sometimes kind of reluctant American presidents to kind of do more to back up, right, in particular Brown versus Board and other Supreme Court rulings. So Eisenhower, the College Board will frequently call him reluctant or gradualist, which essentially means that Eisenhower was not very pro-civil rights. I think he was pretty disappointed or upset that his nominee to the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, had sort of led the charge in deciding Brown versus Board. He didn't really want to deal with any of this. Eisenhower cared about the Cold War, right? That was his big thing. But in 1957, in response to massive resistance by the governor of Arkansas, Eisenhower is going to reluctantly call up the 101st Airborne and send federal troops into Arkansas to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is the famous like Little Rock 9 case. And we see him doing that essentially in the face of, again, resistance from the state governor. Along the same lines, Kennedy much more pro-civil rights than Eisenhower, but wins election very narrowly in 1960 and doesn't really feel like he can come out swinging, I don't think, with something that he feels is controversial like civil rights. So he also needs to be pushed by activists. And after the very famous Birmingham Children's March in 1963, Kennedy gets on television and gives a sort of nationwide televised address where he basically says, I, President Kennedy, am calling on Congress to pass a civil rights bill that will ensure the end of Jim Crow laws, basically the end of de jure segregation. That's quite a big deal. Kennedy's assassinated a few months later, and his vice president, now President Lyndon Baines Johnson, is going to kind of pick up this call and put in place what are really the biggest achievements of this era of the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ends Jim Crow segregation in public places and also outlaws discrimination in employment based on those 5 protected categories. The next one down, the 24th Amendment, makes poll taxes unconstitutional, so that's really big for voting rights. And then finally followed up with the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that basically tries to set up a system to survey states with a history of restricting voting laws to make sure that they don't kind of come up with new ways to restrict voting now that they can't have poll taxes anymore. Last pretty big piece of civil rights legislation from this era is the Fair Housing Act. It's passed in 1968, largely in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King that spring. And what the Fair Housing Act does is this officially outlaws redlining and other racially discriminatory practices in housing. So if we sort of survey this list, what we have is actions of presidents, right? Truman desegregating, Eisenhower enforcing Brown versus Board, Kennedy calling for a civil rights law, Johnson supporting the Civil Rights Act, right, and sort of lobbying for its use. And then we also see actions by Congress, right? So the laws that are passed by Congress, right? The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. And of course, we also see actions by the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board, and there's other court cases too. So those are, again, government actions for civil rights. The government's not just doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, right? They finally have seen the light and decided to do the right thing. They're doing this because they were being pushed by activists, right? And we have a remarkably unified civil rights movement in this time period. But it is good for you to know that it's not just Martin Luther King and then everyone marching in lockstep behind him, but there are in fact dozens, if not hundreds of different organizations, both sort of national level organizations and also more local, just kind of community level organizations organizations that are sort of working in concert with each other to kind of incrementally move and keep pressure to force the government to kind of step in and do something. It is to your benefit to know the name of, I would say, like at least one activist that's not Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. They are very important people, but there's a lot of important people from this time period. So I put a couple of people up here. I'm just going to kind of quickly survey a few of them. So Martin Luther King is the head of an organization called the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that he founds after the Montgomery bus boycotts. Other major national civil rights organizations, there is CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, and the head of that in this era is James Farmer. There is the NAACP, which has been around since the Progressive era, right? It's founded in 1909, and in most of the later 1950s, it's headed by the guy in the middle of the slide. His name is Roy Wilkins. And then the sort of down underneath them right there is Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a great example of someone who was very prominent in a local organization. Hamer was prominent in something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that tried to challenge the sort of white supremacist state Democratic Party in Mississippi in the summer of 1964. Over on the far side, we have three activists who represent kind of the youth wing of the movement. Most of them are leaders, all of them are leaders of an organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which starts after the successful Greensboro sit-ins launched like a sit-in movement. You have Diane Nash at the top, who comes out of the Nashville sit-in movement. You have John Lewis, who is one of the earliest presidents of SNCC and also participates in SNCC's Freedom Ride campaign, which is very famous, and then later in his life is a longtime congressman, just passed away not that long ago. And then at the bottom we have Stokely Carmichael, who is one of the later presidents of SNCC in this time period, and who we're going to talk about as a kind of transitional figure for SNCC out of the civil rights era and into the Black Power era. So those are your activists up at the top there. The College Board also wants you to know that one of the reasons why the civil rights movement takes so long is that there is determined opposition to it. The term that sometimes is used to kind of summarize what's going on in opposition to the civil rights movement is this sort of idea of massive resistance. You have state politicians, especially governors and even congressmen, who are we will do anything that we can, right? We will defy federal orders in order to resist, integrating schools, say, for example. So down at the bottom are two examples of governors who really go to some level of extreme. Orville Faubus of Arkansas is the governor during the Little Rock 9 crisis. So he is the one who sends the Arkansas National Guard to block the integration of Little Rock High School, and then after Little Rock High School has been integrated, he will close every single school in the state of Arkansas for at least a year, and I think maybe more than that, rather than integrate them. So massive resistance. George Wallace is the governor of Alabama, who is elected with the campaign slogan, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And he pledges to block the school door of the University of Alabama rather than see it be integrated. It's a pledge that he will have to walk back eventually. But so those are two good examples, again, of the resistance to civil rights that is pushing back against activists. As far as what activists are doing, right, so some familiar things and perhaps some less familiar things as well. As you can really trace the beginning of kind of this era of civil rights activism back to World War II. I talked a little bit about this in the previous video, but just reminding you that these activists are sort of building on things that organizations like the NAACP had done during World War II, and that the NAACP has been working to challenge Jim Crow laws in court for a long time, for decades, right, since really the 1910s. And so Brown versus Board doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like the first time where they're hey, I know, a court case, right? It's building on decades of activism in previous court cases. The primary tactic that's central to this era of the civil rights movement is nonviolent direct action or nonviolent civil disobedience. Those are both appropriate terms. Civil disobedience, remember, means that you are breaking the law on purpose as a form of protest. So what I have listed on here are what I would think are kind of the most famous examples of civil disobedience from this era. There's so many more, right? We could spend a long time on this, but the Montgomery bus boycott is the most famous. That's the one that involves Rosa Parks and the entire Black community of Montgomery staying off the buses for a year, right, until the city will finally sort of cave and desegregate. The Greensboro sit-ins, right, which is the beginning of the sort of youth-led part of the civil rights movement, as I mentioned. The Freedom Rides, where we have integrated, so white and Black civil rights activists together, getting on buses and going into the Deep South to draw attention to the fact that they're not obeying federal court orders. We have the Birmingham campaign, an attempt to desegregate the city that was known as Bombingham, one of the most infamously segregated cities in the South, with a police chief, is usually called Bull Connor. His name is Eugene Connor, who's sort of known for openly opposing integration and sort of illegally blocking it in many ways. Freedom Summer in Mississippi, that's what I was talking about, Fannie Lou Hamer just a second ago, what she is part of, that tries to organize in opposition to this Mississippi state government and tries to register African Americans to vote. And then famously, kind of at the height or the peak in many ways of the civil rights movement, the Selma marches, which eventually result in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. After 1965, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, after Selma, the movement is going to start to fracture a little bit. Essentially, by this point, by 1965, the movement has achieved ending de jure segregation, right? There is no more legal segregation by race anywhere in the United States. But what still remains is de facto segregation, right? Segregation that exists because of prejudice or habit or structural, right, racism, things that are much more difficult to sort of change and challenge. And there's a lot of disagreement about like, okay, like how do we march against like prejudice, right? Like what's the sort of end goal or how do we sort of do this? And in particular, there's a lot of disagreements about like the tactic of nonviolence and how effective is that for sort of the job that we have going forward. So we're going to see after 1965, for example, the rise of the Black Power movement and kind of the decline of this more unified like nonviolent civil disobedience action. So that's kind of the College Board on the African American Civil Rights Movement in short. Next thing up, we're sort of getting more kind of firmly into the 1960s here. We need to talk a little bit about why the 1960s, and I think the Johnson presidency in particular. Johnson is president from 1963 when Kennedy is assassinated until 1969, so for most of the 60s. Why this is considered the sort of height of big government liberalism, right? So there's sort of two things going on in the 1960s that caused the College Board to call this like the height of liberalism, basically. One is that this is right smack in the middle of the Warren Court era. There are two eras of the Supreme Court that you need to know a little bit about for this class. Marshall Court, which is way early in the 1800s, and then Warren Court here in the 1950s and 1960s. And under Warren Court and Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court has a very expansive vision of the Constitution and is sort of deliberately and consistently interpreting the Constitution to broaden the civil liberties and the rights of Americans. So there's a whole series of court cases, all very important. If you took AP Gov last year, a lot of those might be familiar, but I think that you can break down some of the most important and sort of influential of these cases into like roughly four categories or four types of cases. You do not need to know like all of the names of the Warren Court cases, but it's good to have maybe like one or two that you could talk about if this came up in an LEQ. So of course we have civil rights cases, right? Brown versus Board, which we just talked about. Loving versus Virginia is another great one to cite. That is the one that essentially says that states can't outlaw interracial marriage, so it's a pretty big deal. We also have a whole raft of court cases around the rights of the accused, right? If you're accused of a crime, what rights do you have? So we have cases like Gideon versus Wainwright, which says that if you cannot afford a lawyer, the state has to provide one for you. Mapp versus Ohio, which says that the police have to use search warrants, and if they don't, they can't use any evidence that they find. Miranda versus Arizona, which says like not only do you have rights, but the police have to inform you of your rights, right? Those are three of a multitude. We also have the sort of first real articulation of the idea of a right to privacy existing under the kind of like penumbra of the Bill of Rights. This specifically comes up in the court case Griswold versus Connecticut, which is about the question of the right to birth control. The hormonal birth control pill is introduced in 1960, and it kind of leads to this particular court case. This right established in Griswold versus Connecticut is very central to the later decision in Roe versus Wade, which is after Warren Court, but is still kind of in this sort of class of cases. Last, I think, important category, significant category, we have several cases essentially examining like what does separation of church and state mean, and declaring that public institutions that are receiving public funding, like public schools, can't sort of privilege one religion over another by, for example, hosting public prayer like over the loudspeaker every day at the start of class. So those are a sort of summary of some kind of key Warren Court cases. In particular, like 3 and 4 here are going to be the subject of some conservative backlash, which is one of the reasons I want to highlight them here. In addition to the Warren Court, the other reason why this era, the 1960s, is considered the height of big government liberalism is because of the set of programs proposed and sort of carried out by Lyndon Baines Johnson, right, LBJ, who, like I said, becomes president when Kennedy is assassinated. Johnson is basically an FDR fanboy, right? He sort of came into office as a young man in the FDR New Deal era. He really admires the New Deal and the sort of ambitious nature of this kind of like federal government programs. And Johnson is basically like, well, what if we had a New Deal, but, you know, not because there's a depression, but just to sort of attack the problem of like poverty and the standard of living in the United States. Johnson, who comes from kind of like rural Texas and has done some work in schools there, has kind of a heart for the problems of people who live in systemic poverty, and sees a possibility for the federal government to sort of issue this whole slate of programs that will kind of lift up people, sort of provide a ladder for people basically out of generational poverty. There's so many Great Society programs, so I'm just going to highlight like a couple so you get a sense of what's going on here. This includes 2 new cabinet departments, the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Transportation. We're going to see the beginnings of federally subsidized housing, so the projects, right, and urban renewal projects. Because of Ralph Nader's Safe at Any Speed, we get our first federal like auto safety laws. Car manufacturers have to like include seatbelts. They have to crash test their cars. We see the first environmental laws, the Clean Air and Clean Water Act that limit emissions and dumping into waterways for the first time in American history. The beginning of the federal food stamps program, right, what's called SNAP, right, today. The creation of the OEO, which is the Office of Economic Opportunity, that creates a Job Corps program to give like job training basically to, it's mostly focused on young men in like urban or inner city neighborhoods. Funding for the arts through 2 big endowments, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I think maybe most significant, although these are all really significant, is the expansion of Social Security to create the programs Medicare and Medicaid, which are government-provided health insurance for people who are over the age of 65, so seniors over the age of 65, or people who are like living at or below the federal poverty line. Like if you qualify for food stamps, you would also qualify for like Medicare, Medicaid. That's just a small slice, right? So there's a whole lot that's involved here, but you can see that they basically fall into 2 categories. Some that are really aimed very clearly and directly at people living in poverty and trying to help them sort of access resources to climb out. And then some that are more sort of generally aimed at kind of improving the standard of life for Americans broadly. If you get a Great Society question, very common will they ask you to, you'll be asked to kind of compare it to the New Deal, because these are both really big kind of like government-led programs with like a whole bunch of programs, right, that are sort of passed by executive order. So the really key difference here is that the New Deal is very focused on economic stuff, right? It is really just about tackling the problems of the Great Depression in some kind of radical ways, right? But they are almost all like economically focused. We don't see the New Deal trying to deal with civil rights. We don't see the New Deal trying to tackle social issues, right, in general. The Great Society, on the other hand, is much more broad, right, and comes from a sort of position of much bigger kind of like social and cultural liberalism, includes things like civil rights laws, immigration reform, right, all of the things on this slide. So you should understand the Great Society as the sort of pinnacle of an arc that we have been on since since the populist, but certainly since the progressive era, of sort of more and more and more government involvement, like in people's lives, more and more big government, right, as we're going to come to see kind of the argument go. So that is sort of 1960s liberalism. In response, I think, to the kind of general like liberal vibe of the 1960s, and especially in response to the Vietnam War and the African American civil rights movement, we are going to see a whole like explosion of other like civil rights movements basically, or sometimes they're called identity movements of the 1960s. So you need to know a little bit about at least a couple of these other movements. Like you don't want to go into the test only knowing about the African American civil rights movement. You should have a couple of things to say about. Again, it doesn't have to be all of these movements, but like at least a couple of them. And generally what you should be looking at is sort of like, what are their goals? And then what's maybe like either a major achievement or maybe like a major person, right, who's associated with that movement. So kind of quickly at the top here, like why do these movements rise in the 1960s? They're mostly patterned after the African American civil rights movement, right? That worked. So like, let's try this, but for our issues. Lots of them kind of rise alongside opposition to the Vietnam War and the draft. I think that's especially true of the like Chicano movement, which like Mexican-American movement in California. Lots of them are sort of fueled by this kind of counterculture that we talked about, this idea that sort of young baby boomers in their teens and their early 20s are rejecting kind of like the values of their parents and seeking to make society better. And we also see a strong degree of critique from these movements, who we might broadly refer to as the New Left, of like mainstream liberalism. So we just talked about how liberal LBJ was, but to a lot of the youth of the day, it wasn't liberal enough, right? It still wasn't doing enough to correct like social inequality, economic inequality, equality, and to address various like issues of these groups themselves. So this is a great place to pause, because I'm not going to hit on all of these, but I do just want to kind of highlight a few things in this particular slideshow. So we have a movement that is sometimes alternately called the Latino movement, which is a term that comes from this time period out of an attempt to unite Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans, who were the primary Hispanic populations in the U.S. at the time. We see Cesar Chavez and the migrant workers, and then we also see like a youth-focused movement that's, I think, most exemplified by the high school walkouts in East Los Angeles. They're usually called the blowouts in this time period. We also see, as I mentioned, a real strong connection to the anti-war movement, the Chicano moratorium that is on there. That was a very large anti-war movement headed by the first Chicano president of UCLA, a guy named Rosalio Munoz. Next over, American Indian movement. This is the era, the 1950s is the era where the government shifts to a policy that's called tribal termination. They're trying to sort of get rid of the legal status of tribes and just assimilate all of the tribal members into just being kind of like, regular American citizens. And so there's a tremendous amount of pushback to this that eventually leads to like a pan-Indian movement, a movement that sort of combines activists from a bunch of different tribes into organizations. The most well-known and also I think the most radical is called AIM, the American Indian movement, and they tend to engage in very sort of high-profile activism, like taking over Alcatraz Island and sort of camping there for I think at least a year. So it's quite a while. It's at least several months. Asian American movement, smaller than some of these others. They have a much harder time kind of coalescing. But the big sort of fight here is, number one, this is when we first start to see talk about like reparations or a government apology for Japanese internment. That's not going to happen until, I think it's 1988. It's under Ronald Reagan right at the end of his presidency. But this is when we start to see calls for it. And another thing that a lot of Asian American activists were interested in was the introduction of ethnic studies programs to colleges and universities. I already mentioned that we have a big feminist movement. This is sometimes called second wave feminism that kicks off in this time period. You need to be really careful if you run into a question about women's rights to pay attention to which era they are asking you about, because it is very common for the College Board to ask you a question about this era of the women's rights movement and then try to trick you by putting suffrage in there, right? We have moved beyond suffrage at this point. Women have the right to vote, yay. Now sort of what are the other things that this movement is looking at, in particular equal pay in this time period. Challenging sort of like gender norms. Birth control pill I already mentioned, right, is a big thing that sort of pushes that. Looking for an end to or policies that try to restrict things like sexual harassment in the workplace. Lots of young women joined what were called consciousness raising groups. The idea was trying to take sort of the, it's not just that like, oh, you have like a bad boyfriend who treats you poorly. It's the problem is like the patriarchy, right? It's like a bigger systemic problem, not just like individual problems that you have. So that's feminist movement. We also have what was generally called the gay rights movement at the time. We might sort of read back the newer acronym LGBTQ into that, because it did involve all sorts of people, right, from across the spectrum. We're looking at sort of legal equality and social equality in particular from this movement. There is gay rights activism before Stonewall, but it's much more sort of measured and moderate. It comes from organizations that are called homophile organizations in the 1950s, like the Mattachine Society. Stonewall is really what kicks off like the gay pride movement, or the gay liberation movement as it is often known. One of the big examples is the first Pride March, which is held in 1970 on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots. Thing to be careful about with this particular movement, remember that AIDS and the AIDS activism does not start until the 1980s. The first kind of identified AIDS cases in the United States are in 1981. So you just want to be careful about that. Again, pay attention to like what are the allowable dates, and don't talk about AIDS activism in the 1960s. Black Power movement, as I was kind of mentioning a little bit earlier, sort of rises in the mid-1960s around figures like Stokely Carmichael, who was the president of SNCC at the time, and who sort of comes to feel that the nonviolent civil disobedience tactics of the civil rights movement are sort of limiting, and we've been, marching for, 15 years at this point, and like, when's the time to sort of be more demanding, right? And then also organizations like the Black Panther Party out of California. Civil rights movement is big and important, but it doesn't really do much to impact the lives of Black people who don't live in the South, right? If you live in Oakland, California, or New York, or Chicago, these are really places where we're gonna see like Black Power movements taking hold. They're very focused on like community-based organization and on sort of Black pride and Black identity, right, are kind of the key things there. We also have some more general kind of like students movements. SDS is a Students for a Democratic Society that's founded on college campuses all over the country. Lots of the students' rights stuff gets kind of like blended in with anti-war and anti-draft activism in this time period, and that's fair. Like that very much is a thing that's going on. But there were also movements for student right to free speech in particular on college campuses as well. So that's a lot, right? There's a lot of movements in the 1960s. It's good to keep in mind that you can and should maybe potentially be comparing, especially like the goals and tactics of this era of reforms to the goals and tactics of the antebellum reform movements in the 1830s and 40s, and the progressive era reforms of like the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. Moving on. One of the specific reform movements that the College Board highlights, because it fits into one of the course themes, the theme about the environment, is the environmental movement. And so just a brief look at this one movement in particular on its own lovely slide, special. Right, when we talk about environmentalism, the stuff that's on this slide is, I would say, some of the key terms that you need to know for kind of like the environmental movement broadly. It sort of starts in the progressive era with the whole preservationists and conservationists, right, Teddy Roosevelt and the national park system, those types of things. And then it really returns here in the 1960s. We have the federal government taking some actions, right? I mentioned Johnson's Clean Air and Clean Water Acts that are part of the Great Society. But really what drives the environmental movement forward, and a good pattern for you to know about, is that we tend to see a major high-profile environmental disaster, and then it will be followed by like some environmental reforms. So in 1969, there's two big disasters. There is a major oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, that causes a lot of environmental damage. And then the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catches on fire. A river catching on fire is a fairly dramatic image. And so those two things are really going to pressure the federal government to create the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, which they do in 1970. And we see that sort of same pattern continuing throughout the 70s and then into the 80s. In the 1970s, the gas and oil shortage crisis caused by OPEC leads to a lot of debate about like renewable energy and like wind energy and solar energy. In 1976, Love Canal, which is the incident where we discover that we've built a suburban neighborhood in New York on top of a like toxic chemical dump, leads to a big debate about like toxic waste cleanup. The 3 Mile Island incident, which is like a nuclear reactor leak in Pennsylvania, leads to a debate about nuclear energy. I don't think the United States builds another nuclear power plant for something like 20 years after 3 Mile Island. So that's a pretty big deal, right? And then that pattern continues through into like the later decades as well. So that's the environmental movement. Next key concept, this is looking basically at, we're starting to kind of really get into the 1970s here and kind of our last like section of stuff for this particular unit. And basically how the 1970s are like a transition decade out of the liberalism of the 1960s and towards the more conservatism of the 1980s. So that's kind of what we're tackling over the next few slides here. First off, the 1970s is a decade when our economy changes, right? In the 1870s, we were growing a big industrial and manufacturing economy. Now here we are 100 years later, and that industrial and manufacturing economy is like dying off. American manufacturing is starting to move first out of the Rust Belt and into southern states where there is not a lot of union activity. So it'll move, whatever, auto manufacturing or things like that into states like North Carolina, and then eventually moving overseas as well, right? A few decades later. Other things that are going on in the 1970s economy, in addition to that transition from manufacturing jobs declining and then service jobs on the rise, is that we have an economic recession in the 1970s. Economists call this stagflation, that is high unemployment and also high inflation at the same time. It's kind of unusual to have both of those happening together. That's what you're seeing sort of on the graph down there at the bottom. We also have the oil and gas crisis that I just mentioned as a result of OPEC organizing and sort of flexing their muscles. There's sort of two waves of this, one in 1973 around the Yom Kippur War and the United States' support for Israel, and then one in 1979 around the Iranian hostage crisis, or the United States' support for the deposed Shah of Iran. So there's sort of two spikes there where Middle Eastern politics essentially hit the American oil consumers quite hard. So we have changing economy in the 1970s, or an economy in transition. We also have this decline in trust in government that I mentioned. The United States becomes more cynical overall by the 1970s as a result of a combination of the things that you can see on the slide, the Vietnam War and its unpopularity, and particularly the leak of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed to the public that the government is misleading the Americans about the sort of way that the Vietnam War was progressing. The Watergate scandal is another really big one. The Watergate break-in is in 1972, and then Nixon resigns in 1974. And the story really dominates news media in 73 in 74, and again, I think convinces a lot of Americans that the government is not to be trusted. The Iranian hostage crisis, where the United States looks sort of weak and impotent, right? We can't rescue our citizens, right, from this country that a lot of Americans don't consider to be a very sort of strong or formidable opponent as well. So all of those things are kind of contributing to a decline in American trust in the government. And then as a result of all of this, as a result of the liberalism of the 60s, the changing economy, the decline of trust in public government, we're also going to see the rise of what's usually called neoconservatism, but you can also just say new conservatism or the new right, right, is also, those are all very acceptable ways to talk about this movement. This is a movement that dates all the way back to the 1950s. This is basically a movement inside of the Republican Party that is looking to pull the Republican Party more to the right side of the political spectrum. These are basically people who think that the Republican Party of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s is too centrist, which it was relatively centrist, to be fair. This starts out with complaints that essentially even Republican presidents like Eisenhower and eventually Nixon, who should be, according to the neoconservatives, more kind of in favor of small government, continue to support big government policies. Eisenhower doesn't get rid of Social Security. Nixon introduces the EPA, right, the Environmental Protection Agency. So that's going to fuel some of the rise of neoconservatism. There's also backlash against many of the liberal policy changes and sort of social changes of the 1960s, the Warren Court decisions that we mentioned earlier, civil rights advances, and also continued advances in the 1970s that are looking to figure out how to answer that question that I was mentioning of like, well, okay, we got rid of like de jure segregation, but we're still very segregated. So like, what do we do about de facto segregation? We see various like states and private and public institutions trying policies like, for example, schools try busing students, like white and black students, to achieve racial parity inside of their districts. That's quite unpopular with parents, causes backlash. We also, this is when we see the rise of affirmative action policies, usually in universities, sometimes in hiring or in unemployment, looking to address de facto segregation. Those are also going to create backlash. The 60s have this sort of reputation for being a decade of upheaval, so there's going to be a lot of calls for law and order. That's a big thing with Nixon's 1968 election. And then we also see this sort of growth of essentially what's going to be called the religious right, right? Evangelical preachers, especially televangelists is the term for sort of evangelicals who are on TV, right, who had television programs, who are preaching about sort of the sort of perceived decline, the moral decline of America, and that we've sort of fallen away from like godly principles, etc. And sort of all of those things in a big stew together are going to cause the sort of like rightward pull of the Republican Party as the 1970s go onward. The first sign of this is Nixon's election in 1968. And his appeal to what he called the silent majority. But we also see the founding of organizations like the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank that proposes like conservative legislation, the Federalist Society, which looks to organize essentially more conservative like law students and then judges and kind of organize their legal thinking, the war on drugs, the rise of PACs, political action committees that come from the religious right and that offer money to Republican politicians in exchange for taking positions on issues like prayer in school and anti-abortion. And what that all culminates in, and the very last event of historical period 8, a big turning point for the College Board, is Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. Ronald Reagan is a neoconservative, right? He is sort of a member of the new right, and his sort of election, and not just his election, but his like really strong landslide victory here in 1980 is seen as a sign like of shifting politics. This is what we often call a realigning election, right? In 1932 and 1936, we saw the Democratic Party coalition realigning around the New Deal and New Deal priorities. Here in the 1980 election, we see the Republican Party coalition realigning around Reagan and like neoconservative priorities, right, in politics themselves. So this is where the College Board chooses to end historical period 8. The Cold War is still ongoing, but we are entering a new era of American domestic politics, and I will see you for hopefully a much shorter historical period 9 video in just a bit. Bye, y'all. Thank you.